And for more on this story, I'm joined by Klaus Dodds, a professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway, University of London. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. So way back in 2019, during his first term, Donald Trump talked about the U.S. taking Greenland and what he described as a big real estate deal. Everyone seemed to laugh it off. I think it's clear to say that no one is laughing now. How high are the stakes here?
Good evening. The stakes are incredibly high. I think when that offer was made in 2019 and Trump was rebuffed, and if you remember, the invitation to Denmark was terminated, I think there was a mistaken feeling that this is a man who won't secure a second presidential term, and everyone thought that the issue would just die away. I think when President Trump won the second election in 2024, it was obvious this is very much back on the agenda. And he's been very, very consistent, which is in the sense of thinking of the United States as a dominant Western hemispheric power. And he's made it very clear that he thinks Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, the Caribbean, including Venezuela, are part of that grand design.
Well, so a move to take Greenland by force would most certainly be illegal under international law. But given what we've just seen in Venezuela, that might not matter much to the White House. So how likely do you think that the U.S. could actually move here to take Greenland? Could this really happen?
I don't think President Trump is that bothered about international legal frameworks and the kind of norms associated with the UN Charter around self-determination, territorial integrity. I think that ship, if you will, has well and truly sailed. I think what you're hearing is essentially two or three options. One option would be is that the United States puts a proposal to the people of Greenland directly with a very large cash-based inducement, which goes along the lines of, come and join us in a free association. The second is to say to Denmark, if you remember, President Truman in 1946 offered you $100 million worth of gold. We're prepared to offer you whatever the sum might be in US dollars or gold for outright purchase. And then, of course, the third, the most outlandish, which we shouldn't rule out, is some kind of direct annexation, with all the consequences that would follow, clearly not only for the Kingdom of Denmark, but also for NATO cohesion. And we'd be well and truly past that point where the contemporary international legal order, I think, would be recoverable. Let's
talk about that possibility you were just mentioning, buying Greenland rather than invading it. Is that feasible in your view? And does Denmark even have the authority to sell Greenland?
Well, that's a really good point, because one thing that's worth understanding is that when President Truman raised this idea of purchasing Greenland in 1946, the world was in a very different place. Denmark, for example, had been occupied by Nazi Germany. There was no doubt that Greenland was a remote colony. Fast forward many decades later, you've got Greenland as an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark with high degrees of autonomy, so much so that we talk quite rightly of a government of Greenland and Greenlandic wishes and interests. So it would cause a cataclysmic split within the Kingdom of Denmark if such a purchase was ever contemplated. But I simply make the point, there is historical precedent for the United States making an approach based on a purchase.
Why is Greenland so important to Donald Trump? You know, the White House has called it a national security priority. Why does Trump seem so insistent that the U.S. must have it?
I think for three or four reasons. First things first, we really need to be clear that whilst, I might be a professor of geopolitics, I think a lot of this is about ego politics, not geopolitics. So this is a president who wants to make America great again. And in making America great again, he thinks he will be one of the greatest American presidents. And he's been very, very clear that this could be, I think, something akin to the Trump purchase. You recall the Louisiana purchase of the 19th century. Here's an opportunity to acquire a territory 3 times larger than Texas, and truly to make America great again in terms of expanding its territorial footprint. That's number one. Number two, Greenland does have mineral potential, particularly around rare earths. And everybody, I'm sure, understands well now that minerals of all sorts, including copper, let alone cobalt, lithium, are going to be absolutely essential, not least if you want to build AI data centers, which are also very energy intensive. Thirdly, Donald Trump wants to keep China out of the North American Arctic, and both Greenland and Canada have had over the last decade and a half consistent approaches from Chinese companies, and the last thing he wants to see is China get that foothold. The fourth thing I would say, I think this is part of a grand bargain between Russia and the United States, which goes along the lines of, you let us take Greenland, we'll cut a good deal for you in Ukraine. And by the way, if you want to seize Svalbard, which is a Norwegian territory in the high north, we won't stand in your way because we understand that is integral to your sense of, in this case, bastion defense. So I think, to be honest, it's all of those. And then the final thing, I'm afraid, which is very uncomfortable for Europeans, Donald Trump, I think, wants to punish us as Europeans for free riding on the US security umbrella, and he will cause chaos within the European states. And you'll see that the European response will not be as robust as you might have thought it would have been, given the scale of the threat.
I do want to talk about the European response, but you mentioned there Russia and China, and I wanted to ask you to fact check something that President Trump has been saying. He claims that Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships. Is that true?
Well, I think that's a little bit of a rhetorical flourish. However, it is also true to say that China has become a polar power of some note. China and Russia, as a consequence of the sanctions imposed upon Russia following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, have worked more closely with one another, and some of that undoubtedly includes joint aerial and maritime patrols in various parts of the Arctic. China does have ambitions in the Arctic Ocean, and Russia, of course, as recent events involving the oil tanker siege that you highlighted just a moment or two ago, Russia does have a very active submarine presence in the North Atlantic, and that inevitably involves the waters off Greenland. So all of that, I think, you can take as read, if you will, but that doesn't mean that Denmark has been delinquent in Donald Trump's terms in terms of defense and security. And really, since 1951, Denmark and the United States have had a defense agreement which gives the United States considerable latitude to operate in Greenland. And they could have come back to Denmark and said, we need to look again at this agreement. We need to upscale our military presence. They haven't done that. They've gone literally straight to the nuclear option, if you will, which is we want Greenland.
We only have a short time left, but I wanted to ask you about the European response. You know, many countries have spoken out in defense of Greenland. Do you think that these countries can do anything to prevent Donald Trump from making a move to take Greenland?
We as Europeans, whether we're part of the European Union or not, it doesn't matter. We as Europeans are in a desperately difficult situation. And what you're going to see is fairly weak-worded joint statements from a select number of European leaders saying we stand behind Greenland and Denmark in that hour of need. And yet, I note, my own government here in the UK was very quick to champion its collaboration with the United States when it performed the interception of the Bella 1, the Shadow Fleet oil tanker, and made it very clear the UK saw the United States as its most important security partner. I think that gives you a clue as to how all of this is going to play out. And a final reminder is that the United Kingdom has a number of territories in the Western Hemisphere, and there must be a concern that if the United States acts against Greenland, where else might it act, given the British and the French have overseas territories not that far away from the continental United States?
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Klaus Dodds, professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway, University of London. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24.